Welcome to Eyes on Earth Docks. At sunrise, Florida looks like a promise. The light spills golden across the Atlantic, kissing palm fronds and pastel rooftops. Tourists sip lattes beneath rainbow umbrellas. Joggers trace the curve of the shoreline. It smells of sunscreen and salt and wealth, an eternal vacation written in the language of sunshine. But step one street behind the beachfront and the dream falters. A woman sleeps beneath an overpass, her belongings packed into a stolen grocery cart. A teenage boy rinses his face in a gas station sink. A man rummages through hotel dumpsters before the breakfast buffet begins. No postcard shows this. No travel brochure warns of the tents hidden behind luxury condos or the shanty camps rising beneath hurricane evacuation routes. This is the other Florida, the one that doesn't sell. The state with the third largest homeless population in America. A land of real estate booms and empty stomachs, where a one-bedroom apartment rents for twice the minimum wage, and yet shelters turn people away nightly for lack of space. Where the same breeze that shakes million-dollar yachts also flaps a tattered tarp tied to a shopping cart in Tampa. In 2025, more than 30,000 people are without homes across Florida, an invisible city scattered across highways, beaches, motels, parking lots, and forgotten woods. The reasons are many. Skyrocketing rents, stagnant wages, hurricanes that wipe out whole neighborhoods, a tangle of addiction, trauma, and broken systems. But the outcome is the same: tens of thousands with nowhere to go and fewer places left to hide. And yet, even as the crisis grows, the response shrinks. Laws criminalize sleeping in public. Cities install hostile architecture to keep people moving. Outreach programs buckle under demand. Politicians call for more enforcement, not more empathy. It's as if the problem isn't poverty, it's visibility. Because paradise, after all, must be protected, even if it means pretending its most vulnerable don't exist. This isn't just about housing. It's about belonging. About who gets to stay in the sunshine and who's left to sweat through July nights in a broken-down sedan. It's about a state that built its brand on beauty but buried its suffering in plain sight. This is not a story about failure. It's a story about abandonment. And in Florida in 2025, that abandonment is no longer a crack in the system. It is the system. Florida is often imagined through postcards: white sand beaches, Art Deco skylines, sun-drenched theme parks. But beneath the palm trees and pastel colors, another Florida quietly expands, one where tents cluster under highway overpasses and people sleep in cars parked at rest stops. In 2024, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD), Florida had the third highest homeless population in the United States, following only California and New York. The numbers are stark. Over 30,700 people identified as experiencing homelessness in Florida on a single night in January, a 9% increase from the previous year. And those are just the ones we counted. The crisis is not confined to the streets of Miami or the encampments of Orlando. It stretches across the state, from the Gulf Coast to the Panhandle, from dense cities to isolated rural towns. Jacksonville, once considered a more affordable refuge, now reports the highest number of unsheltered individuals in Northeast Florida. Tampa's shelters operate over capacity, turning away hundreds each week. Even small communities like Ocala or Sebring report rising rates of hidden homelessness, families sleeping in motels, cars, or tents on church property. In many places, the shelter system is stretched beyond its limits. According to the Florida Coalition to End Homelessness, the majority of shelters in metropolitan areas report being at or over capacity. Beds are full, wait lists are long, and those who fall through the cracks often land on sidewalks or inside vehicles. Living in cars has become its own category of survival. Especially in suburban areas, you'll find families parked outside 24-hour grocery stores, retirees in RVs without running water, students studying by flashlight in the backseat. They are rarely counted in official statistics because they move, remain quiet, and don't fit the classic image of homelessness. But they are growing in number, another undercounted population. The chronically homeless, individuals who have been without housing for more than a year while struggling with disabling conditions. In Florida, that number now exceeds 6,000. And many have cycled through shelters, jails, emergency rooms, and the streets in endless rotation. Encampments, once rare outside of major cities, now dot the landscape in dozens of counties. They emerge on vacant lots beneath interstate interchanges beside retention ponds. Some are large and semi-organized, with rules, patrols, and informal leaders. Others are chaotic and dangerous. In both, residents cobble together existence from donations, scavenged materials, and sheer endurance. And yet the data rarely captures the full picture. HUD's point-in-time count, conducted once a year, offers only a snapshot. It misses those who are couchsurfing, doubled up with family, or hiding to avoid child protective services. It doesn't account for those living in abusive temporary arrangements, especially women and LGBTQ+ youth. Rent prices across Florida have skyrocketed. In Miami, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment surpassed $2,300 per month in 2024, far out of reach for someone earning minimum wage. In Orlando, median rent grew by over 20% in just 2 years. The result, even people with jobs and stable histories are being pushed out of housing. The Florida Housing Coalition reports that more than 850,000 extremely low-income renter households are severely cost-burdened, meaning they spend more than half of their income on rent. Many live one paycheck or one emergency away from eviction. Eviction filings have surged post-COVID as emergency rental assistance expired. Landlords faced with high demand and rising property taxes have little incentive to negotiate. Meanwhile, affordable housing construction lags far behind population growth. Zoning restrictions, developer disinterest, and funding gaps mean that for every new luxury condo tower, dozens of low-income residents are displaced. The crisis affects some groups more acutely than others. Black and Hispanic individuals are overrepresented among the homeless, reflecting broader patterns of economic and housing inequality. LGBTQ+ youth, especially those rejected by family, face higher rates of homelessness. So do veterans, people with disabilities, and those aging out of the foster care system. In rural Florida, the picture is even bleaker. With fewer shelters and support services, people facing housing loss often have nowhere to turn. Some sleep in barns, abandoned trailers, or the woods. Local governments, under-resourced and sometimes resistant to acknowledging the problem, struggle to respond. Compounding the crisis are Florida's hurricanes and extreme heat. After storms, temporary housing becomes scarcer, driving more people into prolonged displacement. During summer months, heat-related illnesses rise sharply among the unsheltered, especially those with chronic medical conditions. So what do the numbers tell us? That homelessness in Florida is not a coastal issue or an urban one, it's statewide. That the people affected are not statistics, they're families, veterans, youth, workers. That the challenge isn't just housing, but systems of care, equity, and resilience. Florida's crisis is a tangle of numbers and names, data and desperation. It is visible in tent encampments and invisible in motel rooms. It spans demographics, geography, and circumstance. And each year it grows. Understanding the scale is not about alarmism, it's about clarity, about knowing that behind every decimal point is a decision not yet made, a life not yet stabilized. And that if we don't understand who is homeless, where they are, and how many still wait for shelter, then no solution will ever be more than a guess. Beneath Florida's palm-lined streets and sunlit coasts, another economy breathes in the shadows, improvised, invisible, and essential. It's not measured in stocks or salaries, but in cigarettes traded for socks, meals earned through labor, and survival bartered one day at a time. For thousands experiencing homelessness across the state, this hidden economy is not an anomaly, it's reality. Survival here is work, it's strategy. It's a 24-hour occupation performed without rest, stability, or safety net. For those with no fixed address, no formal job, and no guarantee of tomorrow, every moment is a transaction. In Miami, windshield washers appear between red lights, offering streaky hope in exchange for spare change. In Orlando, roses made from palm fronds bloom briefly in tourist hands, crafted by women whose beds might be made of cardboard. In Tampa and Jacksonville, aluminum cans rattle inside makeshift carts as their owners scour alleys and sidewalks for scraps worth cents. There are no contracts here. No bosses, no insurance, just hustle and a desperate sort of dignity. Recycling and scavenging form the backbone of this informal economy. Cans, copper wire, broken appliances. All collected, sorted, and sold for enough to buy food or a night's reprieve. Behind supermarkets, figures sift through expired goods. At apartment dumpsters, others fish for fixable electronics or wearable clothes. Mental maps are drawn in experience, knowing which bins yield bread and which ones guard secrets. Shelters, too, become economic hubs, not just places of rest but of trade. A pair of donated sneakers might fetch cigarettes. A half-used bus pass might be exchanged for a sandwich. Inside these overcrowded facilities, residents rent half a bed, swap toothpaste for favors, and take on unofficial roles, janitor, mediator, lookout, in return for small advantages. Encampments, often condemned by cities, mirror entire microeconomies. In Broward County's larger camps, some fix bikes, others cook for $1 a plate. Barbers offer trims with dull scissors. Blankets are currency. There are rules, spoken and unspoken, governing trade, space, and trust. And while theft and violence do exist, so too does loyalty, reputation, and communal care. But not all paths are clean. Many women, LGBTQ+ youth, and vulnerable individuals survive by exchanging their bodies for shelter, protection, or food. Petty theft and panhandling blur necessity and criminality. Predators exploit the desperate, offering overpriced, unsafe housing in exchange for silence or submission. This is survival, not stability, and it comes at a cost. Each day grinds down bodies, teeth rot, skin weathers, sleep is brief. Fear is constant. People become experts in public transit routes, safe alleys, and bathroom hours. They learn to read strangers in a blink. To outsiders, it may look like idleness. But it's exhaustion born of a system that demands everything yet offers nothing. Still, there is ingenuity. Shopping carts become shelters. Rainproof tents rise from tarps and rope. Candles and bricks become stoves. Some draw, some sing. Some laugh in defiance. Invention blooms in the cracks, but it shouldn't have to. Resilience is not the goal. Rights are, security is. Florida's hidden economy is a mirror, showing both the resourcefulness of those society has discarded and the failures of the systems meant to support them. It's a monument to endurance and a stark indictment of what we've allowed to happen in plain sight. In the next section, we step into the shadows where survival meets danger, where violence, trauma, and the price of being unseen shape every breath. To understand why homelessness persists in Florida, not as an exception but as a recurring, growing condition, we must look deeper than tents and headlines. We must trace the failure back through decades of systemic neglect, policy missteps, economic choices, and cultural attitudes that have shaped the state's priorities. What we find isn't a single villain or moment of collapse but a pattern, an infrastructure designed for exclusion. Florida's real estate boom of the 2000s and 2010s was touted as a triumph. Condos rose. Skylines gleamed, tourism surged. But in that expansion, affordable housing was quietly sacrificed. Between 2000 and 2020, Florida lost more than 150,000 units of low-income rental housing. Public housing developments were razed or privatized. Meanwhile, luxury development skyrocketed, especially along coastal cities, driven by foreign investment, short-term rentals, and deregulated zoning laws. The result: a state where minimum wage workers must work 90+ hours a week to afford a modest one-bedroom apartment, where eviction rates are among the highest in the country, where rent increases in cities like Miami and Tampa have outpaced wage growth by triple digits, and where, in rural areas, housing stock is so limited that families live doubled up in trailers or sleep in cars because there are no shelters for 100 miles. But housing is only one layer. Florida's approach to mental health care and substance abuse treatment is equally underfunded. The state ranks near the bottom nationally in per capita spending on mental health. Many counties have no inpatient detox facilities. Waitlists for affordable counseling can stretch for months. And emergency rooms, already overwhelmed, have become the default mental health providers for thousands. For those with criminal records or immigration concerns, the system is even more closed. A minor charge, trespassing, loitering, can lead to jail time, a suspended license, and the loss of public benefits. A missed appointment with a social worker can reset the entire housing application process. For undocumented Floridians, fear of deportation keeps many from even trying to access aid. And then there's the bureaucracy. Florida's assistance programs are fragmented and labyrinthine. To apply for housing aid, you might need IDs you've lost, a permanent address you don't have, and access to technology you can't afford. Many applications are only online. Others require travel to offices open only during limited hours. Caseworkers are overburdened, shelter intakes are chaotic, and communication between agencies is rare. The result: people fall through cracks that are now chasms. On top of this, state and local governments have increasingly criminalized homelessness. Cities pass ordinances banning camping, panhandling, or even sleeping in public. Police sweep encampments with little notice, discarding belongings, sometimes including vital medication and personal documents. People cycle between jail and the street, deeper into poverty with each rotation. This strategy isn't just ineffective. It's expensive. Studies show that criminalizing homelessness costs more than housing and services combined. Yet Florida continues to fund police over prevention, punishment over policy. And culturally, there remains a deep stigma. The myth of the lazy homeless or the dangerous addict lingers in public discourse, fueling fear and NIMBYism. Local opposition kills shelter proposals. Residents push back on affordable housing near their neighborhoods. Compassion is often conditional, offered only to those who seem deserving. What all this points to is not a lack of resources, but a lack of political will. A system that prefers short-term optics over long-term solutions. A model of care that treats symptoms, not causes. And a state economy that thrives on exclusion, where tourism wins and poverty remains hidden. Florida fails the unhoused not by accident, but by design. It builds policies around prevention of visibility, not prevention of harm. It rewards development that excludes and punishes those who fall behind. And it treats housing as a commodity for profit, not a human right. But this failure isn't irreversible. Some communities are beginning to push back, calling for housing-first models, demanding more integrated services, and fighting to decriminalize poverty. Nonprofits and activists are building parallel systems of care. And a new generation of Floridians is questioning why, in a land of so much beauty, so many must suffer in the shadows. To change the outcome, we must first name the root. And this is it: Florida's homelessness crisis is not a natural disaster, it's a policy choice. It starts with a tent under a bridge, then a warning, then a fine, then perhaps a pair of handcuffs. In Florida, as in many other parts of the United States, being homeless is increasingly treated not as a humanitarian crisis but as a criminal offense. For those already stripped of shelter, stability, and social safety nets, the punishment isn't just unjust, it's inescapable. Across the state, city ordinances ban behaviors essential to survival. Sleeping in public, sitting on sidewalks, panhandling, storing belongings in parks. These are not symbolic laws, they are actively enforced. In Miami Beach, sleeping on a bench can result in arrest. In Tampa, handing food to unhoused individuals without a permit is a finable offense. In Sarasota, repeatedly sleeping outside can land a person in jail. Police are tasked with enforcing what are, in effect, anti-homelessness laws. But enforcement doesn't address root causes. It displaces people without housing to new corners, pushes them further from services, and adds arrest records that make escaping homelessness even harder. This approach has come to be known as the revolving door. Someone without shelter is fined, arrested, jailed, released, only to return to the same sidewalk, now with more legal barriers to re-entry into society. In cities like Orlando and Jacksonville, public defenders report seeing the same names over and over for quality of life violations: loitering, trespassing, public urination. These aren't crimes of malice, they're symptoms of poverty. Worse, Florida has also embraced state-level legislation that enables the criminalization of aid itself. Some lawmakers have proposed bills penalizing organizations that distribute food or hygiene products without permits. Others have backed funding cuts to harm reduction programs. The logic seems clear: if the problem is invisible, perhaps it doesn't exist, but the damage is real. Each citation or arrest can derail a person's progress toward recovery or housing. It may disqualify them from public housing waitlists. It might cause them to lose their spot at a shelter. For undocumented individuals, it can trigger deportation proceedings. For the mentally ill, it can lead to solitary confinement instead of treatment. These policies also drain public resources. Jailing someone for sleeping in a park costs more than providing them a bed. Dispatching police to remove tents costs more than funding outreach teams. Yet cities persist, citing safety, aesthetics, and business interests. Meanwhile, the courts swell with cases that do little to improve lives. Judges issue fines that can never be paid. Warrants stack up. People cycle through municipal systems that label them criminals for the simple act of trying to survive. In some places, cruelty has been codified into public architecture. Benches are built with dividers to prevent lying down. Sprinklers spray park grounds at odd hours. Sound systems blast classical music to drive people away. These choices are not neutral. They send a message: you are not welcome here. And yet homelessness persists because criminalization doesn't end poverty, it hides it, temporarily, painfully, expensively. What Florida needs is not more police. It's more permanent supportive housing, not more ordinances, but more empathy, not more citations, but more caseworkers. A shift is possible. Some cities like Gainesville have begun experimenting with harm reduction and housing-first approaches, focusing on stability before sobriety, shelter before sanctions. Lawsuits challenging unconstitutional anti-camping bans are gaining traction, and activists across Florida are demanding an end to criminalization in favor of investment. Until then, for many living on the streets, survival will continue to mean navigating a landscape not just of hunger and exposure, but of laws designed to erase them. In a state known for its sun and freedom, being homeless has become a punishable offense. And the cost isn't just borne by those in handcuffs, it's borne by the conscience of the entire state. Not every story in Florida's homelessness crisis ends in despair. Amid the systemic failures and punitive laws, a quieter truth persists, one built not on policies or politics, but on people. Neighbors, volunteers, outreach workers, pastors, social workers, and former unhoused individuals are planting seeds of compassion where the state has sown neglect. You don't always see them. There are no ribbon cuttings or campaign slogans, but on street corners, in church basements, and under overpasses they work. In Miami, every Sunday morning before dawn, a woman named Carmen loads her car with rice, beans, water, and warm clothes. She sets up beneath the I-95 underpass and serves whoever comes, no questions, no forms. She was homeless once herself after fleeing an abusive relationship. Now she says, "This is how I repay the debt." In Tampa, a retired paramedic named Glenn operates a mobile wound care clinic out of a converted RV. He knows most of his patients by name. He treats abscesses, cleans cuts, distributes Narcan, and when he can, connects people to detox beds. Sometimes he just listens. Wounds heal faster when someone cares that you're hurting, he says. These are not isolated efforts. Across Florida, mutual aid networks have risen to fill the vacuum left by fractured government systems. Small nonprofits, faith groups, and grassroots coalitions provide food, hygiene supplies, tents, legal aid, and medical services. Many of these groups are run by those who have lived through homelessness themselves. In Orlando, the group RISE, Reintegrating Individuals Through Support and Empowerment, offers a weekly street court where unhoused individuals can resolve minor legal issues without fear of arrest. The group also helps participants secure ID cards, birth certificates, and job applications, the foundational paperwork needed to re-enter society. In rural Florida, where services are even scarcer, improvised efforts carry extraordinary weight. A pastor in Immokalee runs a small food pantry out of his garage. A school counselor in the Panhandle keeps backpacks full of snacks and hygiene kits for students who couch surf with relatives. A librarian in Gainesville has turned her branch into a sanctuary, offering coffee, outlets, restrooms, and dignity. Many of these efforts are chronically underfunded. They operate on donations, goodwill, and volunteer exhaustion. Some face legal threats for distributing aid without permits. Others are ignored by city councils focused more on real estate value than human value. And yet, they persist. What unites them is not just compassion, but defiance. Defiance of a narrative that says the unhoused are dangerous, lazy, or beyond saving. Defiance of policies that criminalize need and overlook trauma. Defiance of a system that treats suffering as an eyesore instead of a call to action. Some of the quietest heroes are the unhoused themselves. People like Renee, who collects extra sandwiches from outreach vans and redistributes them to those unable to leave their tents. Or Michael, who carries a first aid kit and naloxone and has reversed 4 overdoses in a single month. These acts may go unrecognized by institutions, but they shape the moral architecture of the communities they serve. Even small gestures matter. A barbershop offering free haircuts once a month, a laundromat that waives fees for shelter residents, a local cafe that keeps a suspended meal jar, letting customers pay forward a hot meal for someone in need. These acts do not solve homelessness, but they erode its isolation. Empathy is not a substitute for policy, but it is a beginning, and when carried by many hands, it becomes a force. Across Florida, a subtle transformation is underway. Not everywhere, not fast, but it is there. A teacher who makes sure a student without a home has a cap and gown, a mechanic who fixes a family's van so they can sleep safely, a judge who asks what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. These sparks may not yet light the way to systemic change, but they illuminate something just as important, the refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable. In a state where it is illegal in some cities to sleep, to sit, to exist without shelter, every act of compassion becomes a quiet protest. Every meal shared is a policy resisted. Every story heard is a statistic interrupted. And when those sparks grow, they remind us, change does not begin in legislatures, it begins with people. And sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away. To change a system, you must first change the story it tells. For far too long, the narrative around homelessness in Florida has been shaped by fear, blame, and misinformation. The image is familiar. A disheveled man on a park bench, a woman pushing a cart down a sidewalk, a tent hidden behind a shopping plaza. These visuals are reduced to symbols of failure, danger, or nuisance, never as portraits of real people with complex lives. This simplification is not accidental. It is the result of decades of rhetoric that equates poverty with moral failing, addiction with weakness, and survival with deviance. It fuels laws that criminalize the visible symptoms of homelessness, not the invisible causes. And it allows the public to look away to see a statistic, not a neighbor. The consequences are profound. When the unhoused are portrayed as threatening or irresponsible, it becomes easier to justify punitive measures. When they are seen as helpless or burdensome, it becomes harder to imagine their agency, their contributions, or their recovery. But the truth is different. The truth is nuanced. The single father living in his car after a medical emergency wiped out his savings is not a failure. The teenager couch surfing between friends while trying to finish high school is not irresponsible. The grandmother evicted due to rising rents is not a burden. These are people, and their stories deserve more than pity or panic. They deserve respect. Changing the narrative begins with language. Words matter. Calling someone homeless defines them by absence. Saying person experiencing homelessness reminds us they are more than their situation. One is a label, the other is a life. It also begins with visibility. Media coverage, political speeches, and public campaigns must do more than spotlight tent encampments. They must highlight resilience, challenge stigma, and tell the stories of recovery and resistance. Some cities have begun this shift. Jacksonville launched a public art project that features portraits and stories of formerly unhoused residents, now thriving in jobs, school, and community life. In Orlando, local news outlets partnered with advocacy groups to produce a video series centering the voices of those living on the street. In Miami, a nonprofit runs storytelling workshops where participants craft narratives in their own words, not as case files, but as creators. This shift is not about erasing hardship. It's about broadening the lens. We must also question the assumptions we carry. Why do we presume laziness instead of trauma? Why do we value bootstraps over barriers? Why do we demand sobriety as a precondition for housing rather than a byproduct of stability? To change policy, we must change perception. And to change perception, we must elevate truth. This includes truth about race, class, gender, and health. Black Floridians are disproportionately represented among the unhoused due to generations of systemic racism. LGBTQ+ youth are overrepresented because many are rejected by families. Veterans are at risk because the systems that trained them for war have not always prepared them for peace. Every stereotype masks a structural truth. Every judgment hides a policy failure. Changing the narrative also means listening differently, not just hearing pain but honoring expertise. Many people with lived experience of homelessness become the most effective outreach workers, peer navigators, and policy advocates. Their voices belong not at the margins of debate, but at its center. It means recognizing homelessness not as a monolith, but as a spectrum. The rural family doubling up in a trailer, the young adult on a friend's couch, the older woman sleeping in a storage unit. Each story is unique. Each requires a different response, and it means challenging the comforts of distance. It is easier to believe homelessness is someone else's problem. But when housing becomes unaffordable, wages stagnate, and healthcare remains out of reach, the line between housed and unhoused becomes dangerously thin. Empathy must replace fear. Curiosity must replace contempt. Hope must replace resignation. Florida's path forward depends on more than money or mandates. It depends on imagination. Can we imagine a state where housing is seen as a right, not a reward? Where compassion is policy, not charity? Where the question is not, why don't they just get a job? But what do we need to change so everyone has a chance to live with dignity? Changing the narrative is not the final step, but it is the first. Because once you see someone clearly, it becomes harder to walk past. And once you hear their story, you start to rewrite your own. The crisis of homelessness in Florida is not inevitable. It is the result of political decisions, economic structures, and social neglect. But just as it has been constructed, it can be dismantled. Change begins by recognizing housing as a human right, not a privilege tied to income, status, or luck. First, Florida must invest in deeply affordable housing, not just market-rate apartments, but units specifically reserved for those most at risk. This includes expanding permanent supportive housing for people facing chronic homelessness, integrating mental health services, and ensuring housing stability beyond temporary shelter. Zoning laws need to be reformed to allow for more multifamily developments and reduce barriers to building low-income units. Second, social support systems must be strengthened. That means funding mental health and addiction services, reentry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals, and safety nets that catch people before they fall into homelessness. It also means raising wages and enforcing tenant protections to prevent evictions. Third, the narrative must shift. Florida must stop criminalizing poverty and start treating homelessness as a humanitarian issue, not a law enforcement problem. That means repealing anti-homeless ordinances, banning hostile architecture, and training law enforcement to respond with care, not cuffs. None of this is simple. It requires political will, public investment, and cultural change. But the cost of inaction is already all around us, in lives lost, communities strained, and futures erased. A different Florida is possible, one where prosperity is not reserved for the few but shared by the many. One where no child sleeps in a car, no veteran is left on the street, and no mother must choose between rent and safety. It begins not with charity but with justice. The question is not whether we can change. The question is whether we will. Florida, in all its beauty and contradiction, stands at a crossroads. The beaches are still golden, the sunset still breathtaking, and the tourism campaigns still speak of paradise. But for the tens of thousands who live each day without a home, this state is not paradise. It is purgatory. Throughout this journey, we have traced the scope of homelessness in Florida, not as a singular issue, but as a complex web of systems that fail people again and again. From the staggering statistics to the hidden economies, from the cruelty of criminalization to the sparks of compassion in community efforts, from the narratives that dehumanize to the policies that could heal, we have seen that this crisis is not inevitable. It is manufactured and it is maintained. What emerges from these stories is not just a portrait of suffering but of endurance. Despite everything the unhoused in Florida endure, they endure the heat, the harassment, the hunger. They endure the loneliness and the violence, the bureaucracy and the stigma. They endure not because they are stronger than others, but because they have no choice. To witness this endurance is to be called to action. And yet the state too often forgets them. It forgets the veteran sleeping on a sidewalk despite promises made. It forgets the child doing homework by flashlight in a shelter. It forgets the mother navigating 3 buses just to reach a food bank. This forgetting is not just a political failure. It is a moral one. A society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable. And by that measure, Florida is in peril. But this is not where the story must end. Because while Florida may forget, its people have not. We have met outreach workers who walk miles each day with nothing but a backpack and conviction. We have seen neighbors open up garages and spare rooms. We have heard the voices of those once discarded now leading the way forward. And perhaps most powerfully, we have heard from those still living the struggle, who, despite everything, speak of dreams. Of finishing school, of getting clean, of reuniting with family, of one day having a front door to close. These hopes demand more than applause, they demand action. The path ahead will not be easy. It will require confronting hard truths and entrenched interests. It will require unlearning myths and rebuilding systems. It will require political will, financial investment, and cultural change. But the path exists. We know what works. We have seen it in cities that embrace housing first, in programs that prioritize dignity over punishment, in coalitions that center those with lived experience. The real question is, do we have the courage to walk it? Florida must become a place where no one is invisible, where no one is disposable, where no one is punished for being poor. This means more than fixing broken systems. It means rejecting the very logic that allowed them to break in the first place. The logic that says worth is tied to wealth, that housing is earned, not owed, and that some people are just too difficult to help. We must replace that logic with something braver, something kinder. Because if we do not act, the price will not just be paid by the unhoused. It will be paid by all of us, in the erosion of community, the spread of despair, and the normalization of cruelty. But if we choose differently, if we act with urgency and vision, we can build a Florida that remembers its promises, remembers its people, remembers that dignity is not negotiable. So let this be the last time we call homelessness a mystery or an unsolvable problem. Let it be the last time we ask why they don't work harder, try harder, behave better. Let it be the first time we ask how we can build a world where no one has to survive the way they do. Florida is not broken beyond repair. It is waiting to be reclaimed. By compassion, by policy, by courage. A state that forgets is a state that falls. A people who endure are a people who can rise. Let us rise with them, let us remember, and let us rebuild together.